Hi, I'm Claire Winslow, and for most of my life, I thought my silence made me strong, but it only made me invisible. My family built a world where I was the ghost in every photo, the name never spoken at the dinner table. When I cracked the code that saved lives, they said, "Well, that's not real service." They used my loyalty, erased my legacy, and in the end, they claimed my story as their own. But what if the truth was hidden in a song, in a forgotten letter, in the very name I thought cursed? What happens when the daughter they tried to mute finally speaks? The ceiling fan spun lazily above the decorated auditorium at Naval Base San Diego, whispering the heat of May into the back of my neck. Rows of white chairs stretched in perfect symmetry, filled mostly with proud families and eager young men in uniform. I slipped quietly into the third row from the front, choosing a seat at the end, in civilian clothes that seemed to dull under the bright ceremony lights. My father, Admiral Silas Halstead, retired, revered, and still every bit the Navy man, stood at attention next to my younger brother Jake. Jake's dress blues were immaculate. His smile was wide and sure. The silver seal pin gleamed in my father's steady hand as he affixed it to Jake's chest with solemn pride. I raised a hand, waved, a soft gesture I immediately regretted. Dad's eyes swept past me, unblinking. The applause around me roared like waves I couldn't touch. They were clapping for him, for them, for something I no longer belonged to. I folded my hands in my lap, listening to the national anthem play, every note another reason why I once stayed and why I ultimately left. The seat beside me stayed empty, though my mother was just a row ahead. She hadn't turned around. Maybe she didn't know I was here, or maybe she did. My thoughts drifted, unbidden, to the photo above the fireplace at home. Thanksgiving 5 years ago. Everyone standing in front of Dad's vintage Ford, the oak trees casting patterned shadows over the driveway. I remembered how tightly Mom clutched Jake's waist, how Dad's hand rested firmly on his shoulder. I had stood slightly to the side, unsure of where to place my arms. When the framed photo went up, I noticed it quietly, cruelly. I'd been cropped out. That same hollow began to form now in my chest as the room shifted into another ovation. Jake stepped back from the Admiral and saluted sharply. His eyes scanned the crowd and landed on mine. He gave a quick nod, the kind you might give a familiar face across a grocery store aisle. I smiled, small and thin. I used to think it was enough to be good at what I did. Not heroic, but valuable. Coordinating cyber intelligence, tracking ransomware groups, preventing chaos before it began. I told Dad once, over the phone, that I was leaving sea duty to join Cyber Command. His voice dropped cold and flat. "That's not real Navy," he said. "That's office work." That moment carved something out of me. I hung up before I could cry. I never brought it up again. Now, watching him stand beside Jake, a son molded in his own image, I felt that hollow again, older, wider. I was here, I told myself, only for Jake. That was the noble thing. But even I knew it was a half-truth. I had come hoping deep down that someone would look at me and say, "We see you." The ceremony moved along predictably until an unfamiliar man in uniform stepped onto the stage. He looked younger than Dad, but outranked him now, the 4 stars glinting from his shoulder. He approached the podium and shuffled the papers in his hand. Something changed in the room. He cleared his throat, glanced out at the crowd, and stopped briefly on me. His eyes didn't just land, they lingered. I sat up slightly, unsure why. My hands tightened on the clutch in my lap. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, but there was a weight behind it. A murmur started in the second row, quickly silenced. Beside the stage, my father shifted his weight subtly. My mother finally turned, catching my eye. She blinked as if surprised to find me there. I blinked back. A second of silent acknowledgement. Nothing more. I watched the Admiral. He looked again at his notes, then up. Directly at me. "And before we conclude," he said, "there is one more name." My breath caught. The moment hung there, suspended in the heavy silence that followed. "Captain Halstead?" the Admiral repeated, his voice now stronger, more deliberate. The title rang out like a challenge, but it wasn't a reprimand. It was recognition. My lungs stalled. He was looking directly at me, not through me, not past me, at me. I felt a wave of eyes turn in my direction. The world slowed just a notch, enough to stretch out my awareness like a taut wire. My father, sitting 2 rows ahead, didn't flinch, but the way his shoulders rose said enough. He heard it too. The Admiral hadn't meant him. That title had never sounded strange in military circles, but hearing it here, on my brother's day, in front of this crowd, this family, felt like it didn't belong, or maybe it belonged too much. A few junior officers twisted in their seats, craning their necks, scanning the rows. Their eyes landed on me, in my civilian blouse with my hands folded on my lap. One of them whispered something. I couldn't hear the words, but I felt the meaning behind them ripple through the air like an invisible current. The Admiral stepped away from the podium and began walking, striding, down the steps of the stage. His movements were fluid, decisive. He stopped at my row, turned, and then did something that made my skin prickle. He lifted his hand in a formal salute. To me, the moment crystallized. His palm near his brow, posture exact. He wasn't honoring a relative or paying some private courtesy. This was protocol, precise, public. Last year, he said quietly, but not so quietly that it couldn't be heard by those nearby, Captain Halstead led a classified cyber operation that intercepted and neutralized a breach aimed at paralyzing our Pacific Fleet's communication lines. The impact would have rivaled Pearl Harbor. She didn't ask for credit. She never does. There were no flourishes in his tone, just facts and respect. I nodded stiffly. I didn't rise. My body wouldn't let me. My legs had rooted into the theater's cheap carpet, and besides, what would standing do? I wasn't there for applause. The auditorium didn't erupt in ovation. Not yet. But it shifted. Something shifted. The atmosphere bent, as if forced to acknowledge a weight it had been ignoring for too long. My brother turned in his seat, half smiling, caught between discomfort and admiration. His face read like a question. Did you know this was coming? I didn't. But maybe a part of me had hoped. My mother didn't clap. Her hands remained clenched around the handles of her purse like she was bracing for turbulence. Her jaw was tight, eyes unreadable. There was no gesture of pride, no movement toward me. She looked at the floor. And my father. He sat like a stone, still, unmoving. His hands slowly lifted, not to clap, not to salute, but to scroll through his phone, eyes fixed on the screen, disengaged entirely. It stung, even though it shouldn't have. It wasn't a surprise, after all. But something about being seen in that moment, just once, and still being invisible to him. It cut deeper than rejection. It was erasure. I wasn't sure which was worse, when he ignored me in private, or when he pretended I didn't exist in public. Behind me, a cluster of cadets whispered among themselves. One nudged the other and murmured, "She's the one behind the Halstead protocol." I could feel their glances, their curiosity, their dawning recognition. The murmur spread like an echo caught in tiles. It started with a slow trickle of claps, a hesitant ripple, a few junior officers, then a few more. It built, cautious but steady, like the kind of applause you give when you're not sure if it's okay yet. But you know it should be. I didn't smile. My lips stayed flat, eyes forward, not out of coldness, out of clarity. A strange clarity. All those years I had wished for just a flicker of acknowledgement. And now that it was here, standing in the aisle in a starched uniform, I realized I didn't need it like I once did. What I wanted was something deeper, something he would never give. Validation. As the applause grew, rising in scattered pockets, I looked past the stage, toward the high windows where the late morning sun streamed in, golden and indifferent. The light didn't care who clapped or who looked away, and in the middle of that quiet roar, the one pair of hands that mattered most remained still. My father's fingers scrolled, browsed, dismissed. That silence hurt more than anything he ever said. The hum of the car engine barely filled the silence. I drove aimlessly through the dusky streets of San Diego, rain beginning to trace faint, crooked lines down the windshield. The wipers moved in a slow, rhythmic click, matching the pulse of thoughts in my head. My hands gripped the steering wheel tighter than necessary, knuckles pale in the fading light. That silence, his silence, echoed louder than anything he'd ever yelled. I should have known better. I told myself that the moment I chose a different uniform, a different path, and yet, some foolish part of me had hoped, not for applause, just acknowledgement. Instead, his eyes had glazed past me as if I were another spectator in the crowd. The same eyes that once watched my brother with pride now refused to even glance my way. At a red light, I reached into the glove compartment, searching for napkins. Instead, my fingers brushed against the envelope. I had forgotten it was still there. Cream-colored paper, addressed in my handwriting. Dad. I'd written it almost 6 years ago when I received my promotion to Cyber Command. It was supposed to be a gesture, something human. I'd written the letter on actual stationery, the kind Mom used to save for holiday cards, and included a photo of me holding the plaque. I remembered the line I'd ended it with, word for word. I hope I made you proud, in my own way. He never replied. Months later, while visiting home during Thanksgiving, I saw it, tucked inside the top drawer of his study, unopened, still sealed, as pristine and untouched as the day I mailed it. My breath caught. Even after all this time, that memory stung in a fresh way. I had thought back then that maybe he just hadn't gotten around to it, that he was busy, that perhaps he wasn't good with words, but no. He just didn't care to read it. The light turned green. I didn't move. The rain picked up slightly, blurring the outlines of traffic ahead. The world outside my window looked distorted, like I was watching someone else's life. And yet, in the solitude of the car, I replayed the classified phone call from just last month, the one that started this whole chain of events. The Pentagon contact who verified that my work in detecting the cyber breach had been instrumental. Quiet, buried in layers of red tape and confidentiality, but vital. No one knew. Not even my mother. Not my friends. Not my father, certainly. The name Halstead protocol that was now being whispered in corners of naval briefings. That was me, and it had stayed hidden until the Admiral broke the silence yesterday with that salute. I had been recognized. But the moment was too delayed to mean what I had once wished for. What did I want now? Was this about the mission? Or was I still chasing something else, something pathetic, like validation? I hated the thought, hated how even in triumph I felt hollow. My achievements were meant for the country, not for applause. But something about seeing my father scroll through his phone while everyone else clapped. It burned. The ache wasn't just professional. It went deeper. It always had. I thought back further to when I was 12. There was a banquet at his base. I had begged to go. I even bought a cheap navy blue dress from the clearance rack at Macy's. I remember showing it to him, spinning once. He hadn't even looked up from his paper. "It's not a place for little girls," he muttered. That line wrapped around my ribs like wire. It pushed me harder through the academy, through sleepless nights in bunkers filled with blinking servers, through years of obscurity, all chasing a place where I wouldn't be seen as just a girl. And yet, here I was, accomplished, acknowledged, and still feeling 12. My phone buzzed in the passenger seat. I let it go to voicemail. Then another buzz, an email notification. Out of habit, I glanced at the screen. Subject, Naval Cyber Initiative Panel. Keynote invitation. My stomach twisted. I opened the email. A formal request from the Admiral's office asking if I'd speak on a panel about future cyber threats next month. It wasn't unusual. I'd done smaller talks before, but this was different. Then I saw the attachment. The list of panelists, The fourth name down stopped me cold. Rear Admiral Silas Halstead, moderator, my father. I hovered over the trash icon. I almost deleted it, but I didn't. I hadn't opened the email right away. The subject line sat there, bland and bureaucratic, but something about it ticked beneath the surface. I told myself I wouldn't care, wouldn't get drawn back into the orbit of all that brass and ceremony, but then I saw the name, Admiral Roth, my father's oldest ally. This wasn't just about cybersecurity or representation. For days, I prepared alone, hunched over briefing notes, toggling between classified visuals and public data. I avoided social media, ignored phone calls, stayed off. One afternoon, I sat with my laptop in a corner booth of an old cafe in Hillcrest, steam rising from my untouched tea. A table behind me buzzed with two voices, men, Navy from their cadence. She's slated to speak before Roth. That'll be interesting. Their tone wasn't gossipy. It was measured, like they were reciting a strategy they weren't allowed to question. I didn't turn around, just waited until their cups clinked, then left 5 minutes later without touching my drink. I didn't sleep that night, not from fear, no, but from the flood of calculations racing through my mind. My father wouldn't let Roth walk into that room without a purpose, and that meant I needed to walk in with something bigger than pride. I needed presence. When the call from my mother came, it was past 9. Her voice was warm at first, too warm. "Hi, sweetheart, I just wanted to check in." There was always a pause, a catch in her breath, when she was about to deliver news shaped like a blade. "Your father heard about the panel. He's not pleased." I bit my tongue. Not surprised, not anymore. He just thinks maybe it's not the right setting, or that you don't need this kind of exposure. "This isn't about exposure," I said, my voice clipped. "And it's definitely not about him." She hesitated. "Just be careful, Claire." That phrase always hung too close to manipulation. I ended the call before I said something I'd regret. 2 days later, a secure message blinked across my work line. No name, no traceable signature, just 5 words. "Be precise. They'll be watching." I stared at it for longer than I'd like to admit. I didn't delete it, I didn't forward it, I just read it, again and again until its weight felt less like a threat and more like a warning from a ghost. Even my friends noticed. I canceled drinks, skipped the Sunday farmers market. I told them I was slammed with prep, but the truth was, I couldn't risk loosening my tongue, even in laughter. And then came the agenda. It was printed, couriered to my doorstep like a relic from another time. Glossy paper, embossed crest, all formality and stiffness. I skimmed the lineup. Roth, 2 civilian contractors, a lieutenant from intelligence, and then, last on the list, Commander Jake Halstead, my brother. I stared at the name until it blurred. I hadn't seen him since the pinning ceremony, since I sat in that 3rd row while he stood by our father, glowing like a legacy fulfilled. Now he was on the same panel. This wasn't coincidence. This was choreography. And the conference center at Arlington National Harbor hummed with quiet urgency. I walked through the corridors beside sleek banners about cybersecurity futures and strategic defense. Staff greeted me with professional nods. Some whispered, "Captain Halstead." Others merely noticed I was there at all. Ahead, I spotted Jake chatting casually with Admiral Roth. They laughed, leaning into inside jokes under muted ceiling lights. It was the look of men at ease in a realm where lineage and legacy mattered more than any encryption code. I paused, inhaled, and moved on. Moments later, I leaned against a pillar near the main stage. I pulled my phone from my purse and stopped. Jake's voice rang out clear and unguarded from a nearby open mic. "She's good with code, but let's be real, Dad built her career." The hush followed afterward, like a wound exposing itself. I froze, realized someone must have broadcasted live, heard that. I turned slowly, searching for the source. It didn't matter. And I knew immediately. I slipped into a darkened AV control room, slipped the USB backup from a colleague's hand without a word. White-hot anger burned in me, not because he said it, but because it reminded me of years he'd erased. He'd always minimized me, minimized my work, minimized everything I did to stand on my own. I closed the door and stared at the tape icon blinking on the screen. I didn't click play, I just stared. My voice echoed in my head. Control is the loudest form of power. I thought of every interview I skipped, every compliment I let go unsaid, every time I dampened myself to suit a room. Enough. When I took the stage moments later, I shifted tone. I led with data, statistics on algorithmic bias in government contracting, racial and gender disparities in cybersecurity promotions. And then I looked out at the faces, Admiral Roth included, and said, merit isn't always worn on sleeves, sometimes it's encrypted. I made no mention of family, refused to make a spectacle. But the message landed, eyes narrowed, notes scribbled, eyes flicked toward me in renewed interest. The applause afterward was steady, but not wild, respectful, calculated. That evening, I joined my family at a private dinner. Jake sat rigid, Dad never arrived, something about a last-minute briefing. Mom said softly, "You sounded different tonight." I met her eyes and replied, "Maybe I'm just done translating myself for people who never listened." Jake didn't speak. Mom's eyes glistened with something like recognition or regret. I sipped water. The past felt heavy, but the words I'd spoken felt lighter. Back in my room, my phone pinged. A link opened to a Navy blog post. Leaked audio snippet from today's panel. Headline, Nepotism or Merit? Halstead sibling feud hit summit floor. I stared at headlines and comments, some supportive, others accusing. The comment thread below was brutal and raw, half praising me, half defending Jake. But for the first time, I didn't hate the noise. I welcomed it. I didn't reply to any messages. I didn't delete the tape. I saved it. Tomorrow, I would decide what to do next. The headline clung to the top of my browser like a leech. Nepotism or merit? Winslow sibling feud hits summit floor. Below it, the leaked audio looped in shaky quality. Jake's words, casual and corrosive. "She's good with code, but let's be real. Dad built her career." I scrolled, knowing I shouldn't. The comments poured in like shrapnel. Typical desk jockey looking for attention. She couldn't hack it in the field, so she found another way in. Cyber princess whining again? There were supportive ones too. A few colleagues defending the Halstead protocol, one even reminding readers that classified work doesn't come with public parades. But they were drowned in the tide. I shut the laptop. The apartment felt smaller now, the air dense with judgment. I hadn't heard from Dad. That was expected. But Jake, he texted the next day. "Didn't mean for it to blow up like this. You okay?" I stared at it, chewing the inside of my cheek. That was the most effort he'd ever shown toward my emotional well-being. I waited 24 hours before replying. Expected. 2 hours later, I received an official email from the Office of Naval Integrity. My stomach clenched. It was carefully worded, bureaucratic, sterile. I was being investigated. Improper conduct at professional events was the phrase they used. Not the man who made the comment, not the crew who leaked it. Me. I didn't have proof, but I knew the signature of the men behind it. My father and Admiral Roth had spent decades ensuring women like me stayed in the shadows. This was surgical retaliation. I needed a counterweight. I called someone I hadn't spoken to in months. Commander Lynn Parks, a cybersecurity advisor who owed me a favor and knew how DC's interweb worked. We met in a quiet corner booth at a Turkish restaurant near the Pentagon. She didn't waste time. "I've heard whispers. Roth's grooming Jake for a top logistics post," she said, folding her napkin. "This makes you inconvenient." I pulled a sealed envelope from my briefcase. "This is the origin data for the Halstead protocol, full log history. Jake borrowed my beta code years ago. It patched vulnerabilities in his own project. The Navy praised his system, but it was built on mine." Lynn opened the folder, scanning quickly. Her brows rose. This could flip everything. I'm not asking for vengeance, I said, just for balance. Words started to spread, slowly then faster. I wasn't shouting, just letting facts circulate. Naval insiders began to murmur. She wasn't the problem. A scheduled speaking engagement at Quantico was postponed without explanation. My badge was still valid, but the air felt colder each time I swiped it. Mom called and insisted on a family dinner. You haven't seen Jake in weeks. He wants to talk. I laughed but agreed. I didn't expect an apology. I expected theater. He was already seated when I arrived, wine glass in hand, tie loosened for effect. Mom smiled too tightly. No sign of Dad. Predictable. Jake stood when I approached. Well, if it isn't the better Halstead, he said, with that smugness I'd memorized since age 12. I placed my purse slowly on the table and looked him dead in the eye. No, I said. I'm just proving I've never needed the name. The tension in the room could have cracked the old chandelier above us. I sat across from Jake, my elbows resting lightly on the linen-draped table, every gesture controlled. He chewed aggressively on a dry piece of steak, refusing to look up. Mom tried, bless her, to force normalcy into the conversation. Claire, how's that ethics panel shaping up? She asked, her voice just a little too chipper. Before I could answer, Jake cut in. She won't need that seat long. These kinds of victim promotions usually have an expiration date. The words didn't sting. Not anymore. I didn't flinch. I reached into my bag and slowly laid a thin, bound folder on the table, its redacted seals still visible under the dim light. What's that? He asked, frowning. I opened it to a specific page, lines of obfuscated code and timestamps. These are development logs from a 2019 systems reinforcement program. My logs. Or so the Navy thought. His eyes scanned the lines, lips tightening. You should recognize them, I said evenly. They're your ghost signatures. You never quite mastered how to mask them, Jake. Where did you get that? He hissed, his voice dropping. You should know better than anyone, I said, keeping my tone level. I built the tools that built you. The silence that followed was not the kind that heals. Mom set her fork down with a soft clink. Her face looked paler than usual, mascara smudged under tired eyes. What is she talking about? Jake opened his mouth, then closed it. His hands gripped the edge of the tablecloth like a man looking for anchor. I looked at her. The Halstead protocol wasn't just mine. It was stolen, in parts, my code, attributed elsewhere, to keep his projects afloat. I didn't, Jake began, but Mom raised her hand. Quiet but final. Her gaze moved to me. You were always the daughter with a spine. That terrified your father. And it shamed your brother. Jake stood abruptly, pushing his chair back so fast it scraped loudly. You're pathetic, he muttered, digging through old logs like some obsessive. Obsessive is how wars are won, I said. Not by decorum, by documentation. He stormed out without looking back. Mom stayed silent for a long moment. Then softly, I wish I'd spoken up sooner. I didn't respond. Her regret wasn't mine to process. 3 days later, a defense newsletter I subscribed to pinged my inbox. The headline, Halstead Project Audit Raises Internal Credit Concerns. They didn't name names, but those who read between the lines knew. Jake's scheduled keynote at Annapolis was quietly reassigned. I didn't smile. Not even inwardly. Meanwhile, my own path shifted. A formal offer came to serve on the Navy's Ethics and Intelligence Review Board. I accepted without hesitation. The same day, a note came from Admiral Roth's office requesting a private discussion. I replied with a single line, "Until respect is the default, not the reward, I don't owe civility." The next evening, I was catching up on documentation at home when an email from my father appeared. The subject line was simple. You've made your point. I didn't open it. Not yet. Mom called it a peace dinner, but it felt more like a tribunal. The air was heavy before I even knocked on the door. I'd parked 2 blocks away, needing the walk to collect myself. The folder in my hand, thick with annotated timelines, printed records, redacted files, wasn't just paper. It was history sharpened into weapon. Everyone was already seated when I stepped in. Jake stirred his coffee as if he hadn't seen me. Dad, predictably, didn't stand. Mom rose, gave a tight smile, and gestured me to the table like we were about to share a roast instead of revelations. "Let's keep this civil," she said, more prayer than instruction. Jake broke first. "You really going to air our family out over LinkedIn likes and clearance gossip?" I slid the first document across the table. "This isn't gossip. It's the data trail from the Halstead protocol, start to finish. Cross-reference the code tags. See which ones trace back to me." Jake looked but didn't touch the pages. "You always had a flair for drama." "You always had a flair for taking credit," I said, locking eyes with him. Mom gasped. Dad stared at his untouched glass of water. "You let me take every hit," I turned to him. "Every eye roll in briefing rooms, every dismissed proposal, every transfer. And for what? To keep his star rising?" He finally spoke. "It wasn't personal." I leaned forward. "It was only personal." No one spoke. The silence trembled. "I resigned," I said. "From the AI project. Not because I failed. Because I'm done succeeding by pretending it doesn't cost me." Jake scoffed. "You're reckless." "No," I said, voice steady. "I'm just not available for silence anymore." The email came 2 days later. The podcast episode, quietly titled "The Real Architect of Halstead," went live before I even clicked play. It wasn't sensationalist, just facts. Clean, verified, structured. But the world noticed. Reddit threads buzzed. A technical newsletter praised the segment as a long overdue correction. 3 messages stood out. All from young engineers, all women, all saying versions of the same thing. "Thank you for staying the course." Jake didn't return messages. Dad sent a note. "You were right. Doesn't mean I'm ready to say it aloud." I didn't reply. Mom started stopping by. She never apologized, just asked if I had eaten, if my garden needed pruning, if I still liked lemon bars. I was planting basil when the envelope came, thick, ivory, unmarked. Inside, a single sentence. "We've been watching. Ready to talk." The card had no name. Just thick ivory paper and a single line pressed into it. "We've been watching. Ready to talk?" It felt like a riddle from some forgotten Cold War novel, but it wasn't cryptic for long. The address it led to, an unassuming glass building just outside Arlington, housed one of the most respected civilian research collectives focused on ethical AI and defense transparency. A man in a gray blazer greeted me by my full name and ushered me into a quiet conference room. They had dossiers, research files, a whiteboard filled with acronyms and protocols I recognized, some of which I'd helped create. What struck me most, though, wasn't their knowledge. It was their tone. "We're building something outside the chain," the lead said, "and we need someone who's proven they won't fold under weight." A leadership role, a clean slate, no politics, no family shadows, just people trying to build ethically and openly. It was everything I'd never been offered within the system. After the meeting, I walked for 2 hours, past the Pentagon, past the river, back to my apartment where I collapsed on the old blue couch I hadn't replaced in a decade. My laptop glowed in the dark. I opened the photo folder I never touched. There was my academy graduation. I stood stiff in uniform, shoulders squared like I could bear anything. Another photo, me holding my first functional code in a laminated folder. Beaming. My mother had taken that one. My father had refused to come. Each photo was a breadcrumb, leading back through years of trying to be seen, to be validated, to be his kind of soldier. But those same photos also showed something else. The jaw set in my smile, the humor in my eyes that no rank could erase. I had always belonged to myself. I was still scrolling when the doorbell rang. Jake. He didn't look like a Navy man tonight. No crisp uniform, Just jeans, a hoodie, and a face I couldn't quite read. He held up a thumb drive and said simply, "I listened to it, the podcast." I raised an eyebrow. "They didn't get it all right," he said, stepping inside. "But they got you right." He didn't apologize. He didn't fall to his knees, but he stayed. That was new. He asked about the research group, the job. "You leaving?" "Maybe," I said. "Depends." "On? Are you staying because it's safe, or because you think this place can change?" He didn't answer, but he didn't dodge it either. A few days later, I went back to the naval base one last time. Not in uniform, no clearance badge, just me. Admiral Roth spotted me in the hallway. He nodded, gave nothing more. In the courtyard, a young cadet approached me. Her hair in a tight bun, eyes wide and unsure. "Captain Winslow?" I paused, then I smiled gently. Just Winslow now, that's all I need to be. That night, I sat down with a fresh sheet of paper and wrote my father a letter. No accusations, no requests. Just, "I understand now, and I'm letting it go." I didn't expect a reply, that wasn't the point. The past still walked beside me, but it no longer whispered in my ear. The Halstead name didn't own me. It never did. 3 hours before my flight, I zipped up my bag. New coast, new team. My fingers trembled, not from fear, but anticipation. As the plane ascended into cloud cover, I looked out the window and let my breath settle. I had never been more uncertain, and I had never been more ready. Oregon smelled like wet cedar and new beginnings. The plane touched down mid-morning, gray light pouring over the runway like someone had pulled the sky's curtain halfway open. The rental car was modest. The house I chose was more so. A cottage near the coast with a leaky screen door and ivy that had long since claimed the mailbox. It felt like something I could grow into, not just live in. My new role was unofficially called Ethics Whisperer. Officially, I was the community ethics advisor for a green tech nonprofit, one that had quietly courted me after the leak. They admired clarity, not conflict, they said. That was the first time I'd heard those words and not felt the need to brace. Then came Laura. She wasn't my mother, of course, but something in her manner, the pause before speaking, the weight of restraint, woke a tenderness I didn't know I still carried. I kept my distance at first, letting routine settle into the gaps. Work, grocery runs, long walks by the tide pools. But she noticed. "You look like someone who remembers too much," she said one day, handing me coffee. I didn't answer. Not then. The library in town was small, its smell familiar, paper, dust, something almost holy. I picked up an old book on ethics and machine learning, curious to see what had trickled into the civilian world. At home, when I cracked it open, a letter fluttered out. It wasn't signed, it wasn't addressed, but the handwriting stopped me cold. "You were always the fire," it read, "and I feared flame." The turns of the script, the hesitant curves, I'd memorized them in birthday cards and sticky notes on my childhood lunchboxes. It was my mother's. The letter spoke of guilt, of misread strength, of not knowing how to mother someone who didn't need coddling but did need championing. It was dated months ago. I stared at the last line. "If you ever find this, maybe you'll know I tried, even if too late." I folded it back gently and slid it into an envelope. Laura invited me to a women's circle that week. Just first names, no resumes, stories shared around a fire pit that crackled like memory. I spoke only once. "I came here to grow something different, maybe slower, maybe kinder." Laura nodded. "That's what roots are for." Later, I mailed the letter to the old P.O. box Dad used for Navy correspondence. I included a note. "I got your message. I think I'm ready if you are." That evening, I walked the beach until my calves ached. There were no epiphanies, just the comfort of choosing stillness without apology. Just before bed, a knock, not forceful, not hesitant. When I opened the door, a woman stood there. Storm gray eyes. Wind-tangled hair. "I think I know you," she said. When I opened the door, I expected a solicitor, maybe a curious neighbor. Not this. She looked like someone from a photo I hadn't seen yet. Hair windswept, eyes half cautious, half sure. She said her name was Elise, and that she'd known my mother, decades ago, in a halfway house. Something in her voice steadied me. I stepped aside. We ended up at the little cafe by the bluff, the one with chipped cups and fogged windows. Outside, the rain moved sideways in the wind. Inside, the warmth felt undeserved. Elise cradled her tea. She called herself fireproof in those days. But she wasn't. She pulled an envelope from her coat. Inside, a photo, creased and sun-faded. My mother laughing in a field of wildflowers, younger than I'd ever imagined her. Next to her, Elise, arm thrown over her shoulder. "She told me you scared her," Elise said, carefully. "Not because of who you were, because you were hers, and she didn't think she deserved someone like you." I held the photo tight. That field, the one I'd walked just days before, now seemed like a message left decades in advance. Later that evening, Elise returned. She handed me a cassette, no label. "Your mom, a house show, 1981. I dug out a thrifted player, pressed play. The sound cracked and hissed. Then her voice, singing. The words floated out in lullaby form, rose-laced cheeks, storm winds, a door left slightly open. My name hidden in metaphor. Tears came quietly, not from blame, from recognition. I called Laura. We walked the trail again, side by side. I didn't explain why. At the bench on the overlook, I left a pressed wildflower and a note. "I get it now. That's enough." When Elise hugged me goodbye, she didn't ask for more, just said, "Don't wait too long." She waited longer than most would have. I sat that night in my small kitchen, the photo in one hand, cassette in the other. I hadn't forgiven her. Not yet. But for the first time, I felt the ache without the weight. And that was something. I played the tape again that night, letting her voice fill the silence. But this time I noticed something new. A man's voice. In the background. Young, sure, too clear to mistake. My father. He was giving directions. Names. Places. In the middle of her song, like he didn't even care the recorder was running. A confession hidden in plain sound. I froze. The next morning I called Ava, the lawyer Tom had introduced me 2 months ago. Her line was brisk, professional, but when I played the snippet over the phone, she went silent. "That's admissible," she said. "Maybe not a smoking gun, but enough for civil pressure, possibly more." By that afternoon, we had started filing. Not for compensation, not revenge, just the truth. I wanted his name, and the men around him, recorded where they couldn't erase it. 2 weeks later, I showed up at one of his public talks, a modest crowd, church backdrop. He stood at the podium, still cloaked in the armor of righteousness. I waited until the QA. When the microphone passed to me, I didn't flinch. "I'm not here to destroy your reputation," I said. "I'm here to reclaim mine." Then I played the tape. The room hushed. A woman in the front row covered her mouth. Phones lifted. He didn't speak, didn't move, just stared, like someone watching the past catch up. Later that week, I dug through a pile of old documents Aunt Jean had mailed me after the funeral. One folder I hadn't opened. Inside, a letter. My mother's handwriting. She wrote that she named me after her sister, her anchor during dark years, not the man we both feared. "You are not his legacy," she wrote. "You are my hope made flesh." I sat for hours, the letter in my lap. Then I acted. I filed for a legal name change, reclaiming my grandmother's maiden name. I registered a podcast under that name too, Voices Without Permission. The first episode, the tape, raw, unedited. My commentary followed, not polished but clear. I said what so many needed to hear. Survival isn't quiet, and silence is never consent. Emails flooded in. Women, men, survivors, daughters, sons, people who had hidden their names to stay safe, now wanting to speak. On the day my new ID arrived, I walked to the cliff by the overlook. I brought the letter, lit a match, watched the paper curl and lift in the wind. It wasn't her I was burning. It was the weight. "You don't get to define me," I whispered. "Not anymore." And the wind carried it all away. And some stories don't end with a bang, but with a choice. Mine ended not in court or confrontation, but in a quiet kitchen, a changed name, a burned letter, and a podcast microphone turned on. I used to think freedom was something granted. Now I know it's something reclaimed. If you're watching this and carrying a silence of your own, let me say this. You are not what they did to you. You are not the name they gave you, the doubt they planted, or the shame they hoped would stay. You are your choices, especially the ones you made in defiance. In America, we talk a lot about liberty. But the truest liberty, it's telling your story in your own voice, not the one shaped by fear or legacy. So I'll leave you with this. What part of your past have you mistaken for identity? And if you could rename your life, what would you call it? If this story touched you, drop a 1 in the comments, or tell me where you're watching from. And if you didn't connect with it, I'd love to know why, and where you are in your own story. If you found strength in these words, please subscribe. There are more stories waiting, ones that heal, question, and connect us. Your voice matters here. Let's keep talking.